Today we're going to talk about the MVP, the most valuable pigeon. So I ask you the question, what were some of the most important factors of World War I? Was it the technological advancement of tanks? Was it the power of the British Navy? Was it the strength and will of every soldier who gave their all for their country? Or was it the pigeons? Now, I know what you're thinking, Jack, you've gone completely mad, but pigeons, they're actually a lot more important than you might think, and they played a pivotal role in World War I. We've also seen a pigeon in the trailer for BF1-2, so does that mean Pigeon UCAV confirmed? There was one particular pigeon that I believe deserves our utmost respect, Cher Ami. Just look at that picture, that's actually her. When she passed away after serving her country proudly, she was stuffed and is currently on display in the Smithsonian for all to see. Now I imagine you're wondering, what on earth did a pigeon do to warrant all this publicity, folk stories, and to be put on public display after her death? Well, get this, she single-handedly saved the lives of 200 American soldiers whilst being a pigeon. She was just doing what she does best, flying, oblivious to what was happening beneath her. Bullets flying past, German soldiers trying to take her out, but she didn't let that distract her from her mission because she was a badass. Next time you head out to your car and you see an unwanted gift on your windscreen left by what some people call the rats of the sky, stop for a second and think about Cher. Not the singer, the pigeon, and how she helped shape history. Okay, so she saved 200 lives, but in all seriousness, how did she do that? Picture the scene. It's late September 1918 in northern France. It's actually not long until the end of the war in November, but there's one last battle raging on. In fact, it's one of the biggest battles in the First World War, lasting for 47 days. It was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and by the end of the war, over 1 million Allied soldiers would be involved and over 25,000 American soldiers would lose their lives. There was a group of 500 American soldiers led by Major Charles Whittlesey that were trapped and surrounded by Germans. After a day of fighting, only 200 of them were left, and to make the situation even worse, the American artillery teams who were back behind them in a different line did not know their location and accidentally were firing shells at them as well. Not an ideal situation. The Major had to act fast and he sent out 2 homing pigeons with messages for the American army for help, but both were shot down by what I can only assume were professional pigeon shooters. I'm guessing that isn't a thing, but you had to be a pretty good shot to take out a flying pigeon, but the German soldiers knew that the Allies used them as messengers and would actively aim at them if they saw them in the sky. Okay, so 2 pigeons are dead and up to the plate steps Cher Ami. She doesn't know the situation, after all, she's a pigeon. She's got no idea that 2 of her kin have just been shot down and that she's probably next, but you know what? Cher Ami didn't care. She's about as hardcore as a pigeon is gonna get. Now before we go into what happened next, let's just take a second to talk about the communication methods used during the First World War. You have to remember that when the war started, radios were in their infancy and the equipment they had available was very primitive. Not only that, but radios were very heavy and bulky and sometimes only had a range of around 2,000 yards. Not really what you need when you want to communicate with your base many miles away. Horses were often used to just cart around radio equipment because it was too much to carry for a soldier. As well as being heavy and bulky, they were also notoriously unreliable compared with the wired telephone. Wired telephones themselves were used in order for troops to communicate across the battlefield. Early telephones would have long wires linking them to switchboards, but as you can expect, they were only as reliable as the wires that connected them, and these wires were often broken by shell fire or just by soldiers rushing over them or purposefully destroyed. Because of this, everything from visual signals and written messages carried by dogs and carrier pigeons were used to communicate between commanding officers and their men. But get this for an interesting stat. During the First World War, over 100,000 pigeons were used to send messages, with a success rate of 95% getting through to their destination with a message. It's worth pointing out as well that by the time the war ended, there were significant improvements in wireless systems. Continuous wave wireless sets were used to transmit messages from relay stations to battalions and military headquarters, bypassing the need to rely on messages by animal runners. This improvement in wireless would eventually lead to the foundations of the communications used during the Second World War and actually set the foundations for modern communications that are still being used today. Okay, back to Cher Ami. What happened? She doesn't care about future communications. All she knows is that she's got one job and she needs to make it back with this important message from the Major. He attached the message to her leg and she takes to the sky, but the Germans instantly fire on her. And during this barrage of gunfire, she was shot in her breast, she was blinded in one eye, and shot in her leg so badly that it was only holding on by a tendon. Yet, despite her injuries and against all of the odds, she made it back home. It took her 25 minutes to pass through the rain of fire, and she flew a whopping 25 miles back to the Allied lines with heavy injuries. Just think about that for a second. This is a pigeon, shot multiple times, blind in one eye, shot in her chest, her leg is falling off, and yet she still manages to find a way back to her base. Maybe it was fate that she made it back on that day. And because of the message she delivered, the friendly fire was able to stop, and eventually the Lost Battalion, as they were to become known as, were able to break out to safety. And they made sure to give Cher Ami their appreciation as well as a wooden leg to replace the one that she lost. Amazingly, this bird was given the French Croix de Guerre for her bravery. I imagine that that's the only pigeon to ever receive that award. Sadly, Cher Ami died a year later due to complications from her injuries, but of course she was stuffed and lives on in spirit in the Smithsonian in Washington DC, where all visitors can learn of her bravery. Now I know this sounds a bit mad, but like I said, we've already seen pigeons in the BF1 trailer, but of course that looks like it's single player gameplay, but they did play a big part in the war. There's a rumour floating around based off a leak right now of a pigeon game mode in the game, but quite how that would work I don't know. Perhaps Cher Ami will even make an appearance, and translated it means dear friend, and without doubt Cher Ami was the most valuable pigeon. As always, thank you for watching the video guys. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, a thumbs down, and I'll see you in the next one.